When a wealthy Lowcountry power couple confronts their financial manager over missing funds, they immediately vanish from their Hilton Head Island retreat. Unanswered questions haunt a tale of deadly greed in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This is the revisited and enhanced edition of one of our early episodes, which features the unsolved case of Elizabeth and John Calvert. The original edition was recorded in 2020, and we've revisited and re-recorded an episode on her case in 2025. As I'm sure those of you who've been listening since the early days of Last Seen Alive have noticed, our production and audio quality have improved significantly over the years. Lately, we've been working on remaking our earlier episodes. When we originally recorded them, we were doing the best we knew how at the time. However, our best wasn't the best, and we've learned a lot since then. We want to honor those victims by telling their stories with the production quality they deserve. So, we've been completely remaking all of our early episodes, including this one. Before we get into Elizabeth and John's story, please note that this episode contains discussion of suicide. Please listen with care. Elizabeth and John Calvert were last seen alive on March 3rd, 2008. They were 45 and 47 years old, respectively, and lived part-time in Atlanta, Georgia, and part-time on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. Hilton Head Island is one of the most popular island vacation destinations in the American South, and for good reason. It's got beautiful beaches, museums, world-class golf, a wildlife refuge, historical tours, and even distilleries and breweries. There's so much to do, in fact, that it's virtually impossible to experience it all during a weekend or even a week-long vacation. For those who can afford it, the island's southern charm and recreational amenities can be experienced year-round. And Elizabeth and John could afford it. Elizabeth was an attorney who practiced business law at a Savannah, Georgia firm, and John was a successful businessman who owned companies that leased out yacht slips, as well as over 100 vacation properties on Hilton Head. Both Elizabeth and John were child-free and career-focused. They differed in other ways, but they complemented each other with their differences. Those who knew them described Elizabeth as direct, a hard charger who never ran short on practicality. As for John, he was the more social and relaxed of the two.
Yeah, I'd imagine he'd have to be if you're managing leased properties and interacting with more of the general public instead of lawyers and businesses that you're doing legal work for.
Exactly. You have to be able to get along with all sorts, and he did. He really excelled at the relationship building side of their joint venture. And it worked perfectly for them. They'd been happily married for over 20 years, and together they were a dynamic power couple who embraced the island both for business and for pleasure. They lived there part-time on a 40-foot yacht they called the Yellow Jacket, which they docked at the Harbor Town Yacht Basin, a marina that borders the Sea Pines Resort. Needless to say, the Calverts were doing well for themselves financially. This was further evidenced by the fact that they also had a nice home in Atlanta and a small plane. In addition to being a successful lawyer, Elizabeth was also a pilot.
So many elements of this are like people's ideal dream lives.
Right. They worked really hard for the life that they had, and they enjoyed it. They enjoyed it a lot. Now, despite the Calverts' professional success and upscale lifestyle, though, in the spring of 2008, there was trouble in paradise. Not trouble between Elizabeth and John, but rather trouble between the couple and a business associate. That man's name was Dennis Gerwing, and he was a 54-year-old certified public accountant who worked as chief financial officer of a company called the Club Group. The Club Group was a golf course and resort management company which the Calverts had hired to manage the financial, administrative, and HR affairs of their company, Harbor Town Holdings. As for Gerwing, he essentially functioned as an accountant for the Calverts business.
Okay.
Hiring a third party to manage their business's financial affairs was supposed to make life easier for the Calverts, but by the time March of 2008 rolled around, they no longer felt that the Club Group's services were the best fit for their needs. They'd been easing into ending the arrangement for several months at that point, and during that process, they'd grown suspicious of Dennis Gerwing. Suspicious because they'd trusted him with their business's finances, only to discover that a significant amount of money was inexplicably unaccounted for. To address this, the Calverts planned to broach the subject during their next meeting with Gerwing, which was scheduled for the evening of March 3rd. During that meeting, they would confront him over missing funds somewhere to the tune of nearly $100,000.
America was heading into a recession at that time?
Yes.
And $100,000 would have gone a very long way at that point in time.
And still would. We're not talking about a rounding error here. There was a significant chunk of money missing.
As I so often do, I pulled up usinflationcalculator.com, and in 2008, $100,000 is $148,000. It's increased by almost 50%.
Wow.
So $150,000 is no small error.
Sure. Now, and that was only what had been taken from them. According to what a friend of John's told the state, they suspected that if they were being stolen from, they weren't the only ones. The club group managed many other businesses, and they knew it was possible that many of them had been affected as well. It should be noted that Gerwing had been working with the Calverts to end their association with the club group for several months at that point, so it was far from the first meeting they'd had on the matter, and the fact that their professional association would soon be ending was no surprise. In fact, Gerwing himself had been the one to request the March 3rd meeting. He'd specifically requested that both Elizabeth and John be present and had promised to bring some important documents they'd requested.
Okay, so a few things stand out. Just because they've had previous meetings doesn't mean that they had yet accused him of harboring or hiding any of these funds.
Right.
So
they hadn't made any such accusations yet.
So that could have really triggered a very tense situation in that meeting.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's also always going to be kind of suspicious when the accountant that's accused of this requests the meeting.
Sure. So that evening, the three of them met as planned, and that's where the facts regarding Elizabeth and John's whereabouts abruptly end. We don't know what excuses Gerwing may have given the Calverts upon being confronted about the missing money, what lies he may or may not have told. We have no idea what his response was when confronted. That knowledge disappeared along with John and Elizabeth. After the meeting, they were never seen again. The next day, both John and Elizabeth failed to show up for business meetings they had scheduled, which was wildly out of character for both of them. Some of John's coworkers tried to reach him, but no matter how many times they called, he didn't answer. So they called Elizabeth's brother, David, and alerted him to the situation. Neither of the Calverts answered the phone for David either, so he went to their home in Atlanta in case they'd returned there. When they failed to answer the door, he let himself into the house, but found it empty. It was at that point that he contacted police to report them missing. Back on Hilton Head Island, after speaking with David, along with several co-workers of the Calverts, none of whom were able to shed light on the couple's whereabouts, investigators from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office were almost immediately interested in Dennis Gerwing. He seemed like a person who might have critical information relevant to the Calverts' whereabouts. After all, he was the last known person to have seen them. Naturally, they had questions for him.
So from an investigative standpoint, this is obviously going to be a more complex than average missing person investigation because you do have two jurisdictions that both have to check multiple different places because they have two different residences.
Not to mention Elizabeth works in Savannah, so there's a third city right there.
Yeah, so I guess that does make three different jurisdictions that all have to interact with each other and check different places.
Mm-hmm.
However, my assumption would be that Beaufort would probably take the lead because that was the last known place that they both were.
Yes, that's exactly what happened.
However, Gerwing definitely would be one of the first people I'd be checking into if I were running this investigation, even before I hear from the other two departments, because he was the last known person to see them that we know of.
Right, and Gerwing answered the Beaufort County investigators' questions at first. He denied any knowledge of the Calverts' location, and during the interview, investigators noticed a suspicious injury to one of his hands. We'll get into that in more detail later. For now, just know that after this day, the day that the Calverts vanished, that is, Gerwing never spoke to investigators again. Instead, he lawyered up. Naturally, investigators found this suspicious. Also suspicious was the fact that during the initial interview with police, Gerwing wasn't honest. According to the Island Packet, he lied about where he'd been on the day the Calverts had disappeared and about which of his two vehicles he'd been driving. And he wasn't a very sophisticated liar, so there were multiple inconsistencies in his story that were immediately apparent to the officer conducting the interview.
It sounds like he had really good reasons to go ahead and lawyer up, because all of that just makes him highly suspicious and would bring down the ire of any investigators, I assume.
Right. Now, given this, it probably comes as no shock that investigators were quick to obtain search warrants for Gerwing's property. Specifically, they secured permission to search his home, his office, and both of his vehicles. While they did this, Gerwing at first stayed at a friend's home. Actually, he stayed there for 2 nights and, according to reporting by Graham Cawthon for WJCL News, when he departed on the second morning, he instructed his friend to call another friend in the event that he was arrested.
Okay, so he obviously at least anticipated being arrested for it.
Yes, and that's the last known thing he said to anybody. 2 days later, when his lawyer tried numerous times to get a hold of him and couldn't, he went to a condo where he knew Gerwing to be staying, right across the street from his home. The condo was a timeshare owned by his employer, the club group. Its blinds were drawn tightly shut, and there was no evidence of anyone stirring within. Together with the help of some of Gerwing's business associates, Gerwing's lawyer managed to force entry into the condo. According to reporting for the Island Packet, once inside, they were unable to locate Gerwing. They did find, however, that the bathroom door was locked from the inside. At that point, with little other choice, they called police. That was on the afternoon of March 11th, 1 week since the Calvert's disappearance, and earlier that day, police had publicly announced that Gerwing was a person of interest in the case. Law enforcement and the island's fire department responded and forced entry into the bathroom. Inside, they found Gerwing. He was deceased, and there was little doubt what had happened to him. A comforter had been draped over the interior of the bathtub. It was soaked in blood, and it held Gerwing's unclothed corpse, the limbs of which rested sprawled over the tub walls. According to the Island Packet, his body bore several obvious lacerations, one to each side of his lower neck, one to his left wrist, one to his right calf, and one to his right thigh. It would later be determined that the cut to his thigh had been the fatal wound. Each of the lacerations had been made with a cheap, serrated steak knife that lay close at hand, caked with blood. It was a gruesome sight to behold, and is a gruesome act to imagine. Clearly, Gerwing had made repeated cuts to his body until one had proven fatal. Autopsy results would reveal that he'd ingested a large amount of diphenhydramine, an over-the-counter antihistamine sometimes sold under the brand name Benadryl, before killing himself. Diphenhydramine is well known for causing drowsiness, even at regular doses. Naturally, an overdose of the antihistamine can have an even greater depressant effect. A normal adult dose is 25 to 50 milligrams, depending on the severity of symptoms and whether 1 or 2 tablets are taken. That day, though, Gerwing took over 1,000 milligrams of diphenhydramine.
That is an incredible amount.
Yes, it's a massive overdose. Now, we don't have any way to know for sure, but it's possible that Gerwing initially thought he could commit suicide with the antihistamine overdose alone, and eventually grew desperate enough to grab a knife from the kitchen and implement a hasty Plan B when the antihistamine didn't have the effect he'd imagined.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. However, that is an unimaginable level of pain for trying to commit suicide.
Yes. Now, it's also possible that he'd planned to use the knife all along and had thought that the drowsiness caused by the antihistamine would make it easier and perhaps even less painful to take his own life. Either way, his desperate suicide attempt was ultimately successful. He bled to death while the police searched his property for any sign of his involvement in the Calvert's disappearance. Now, you may be wondering whether Gerwing left a suicide note, possibly one confessing to his role in the couple's disappearance and maybe revealing their location.
Just simple logic would dictate that if that had been the case, we wouldn't be doing this episode right now.
Right, of course. But he did leave a note. 2, actually. Investigators found one in the condo's bedroom and another on the bathroom counter by one of the sinks. However, the notes didn't say exactly what had happened to the Calverts or even whether he'd been responsible, at least not directly. To be honest, the notes were borderline incoherent. I don't know if he wrote them after he took all that diphenhydramine or what, but that can certainly cause delirium, so it makes sense. In them, he rambled at length and did confess to stealing money from various clients he'd served in his role at the club group. In total, over $2 million.
This is an extreme measure, especially if you are innocent.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not surprised that the Calverts weren't the only ones that he was stealing from, because he was in a position of great trust that was easily exploited. I mean, you're working with multiple different business accounts. And one of the reasons why you would hire his business to run your accounts is so that you don't have to pinch pennies and monitor every dollar coming in and out. You have somebody whose job is supposed to be doing that.
Right.
So it's definitely an easy position to steal from people in.
Very. So here's an excerpt from the end of one of his suicide notes. Quote, P.S. I have acted completely alone in all actions committed. I knew the risks of this happening and believe taking myself out of the game is the best way to move everyone as quickly as possible past all events. All anger should be directed towards me. Burn my body and dispose without service. It happened in SPC. Nothing happened at Bent Tree House. End quote.
So the conspiracy side of me really says that that's a very convenient note if somebody is covering up for this and the business is trying to just move on with it.
Maybe he just felt guilty. He'd betrayed the trust of people who were supposed to be his friends.
Yeah.
Of course, in the notes, as we just read, Gerwing claimed that he'd acted alone in his embezzling, and when investigators later questioned the CEO of the club group, he stated that he'd had no knowledge of the theft. He also had a solid alibi for where he'd been the evening of the Calverts' disappearance, indicating that if Gerwing had in fact harmed them then, he had not assisted. A quick side note here. Because Gerwing's actions drew the club group into an unwanted spotlight by association, I want to take the time to mention that after Gerwing died and his embezzling was discovered, the club group's CEO paid a lot of those stolen funds back, not just by liquidating Gerwing's assets, but also with company money and even his own money out of his own pocket. As far as anyone knows and has been able to determine, even after all these years, Gerwing acted alone in his financial crimes.
Okay, that very clearly covers up any thought of that conspiracy. It really does sound like they did everything they could to regain the trust of their clients.
Right. He didn't just, betray his clients. He betrayed his coworkers too, caused them this huge ordeal. Anyway, moving on. Investigators worked quickly to uncover just what kind of life Gerwing had been living before he'd ended it, and the picture was not pretty. While there's no such thing as a good reason to betray the trust and siphon away the assets of people and friends who've placed their confidence in you, it quickly became apparent that Gerwing, he didn't have some secret need for money. He had been driven by sheer materialistic greed. He'd blown the embezzled funds on gambling, alcohol, frequent visits to adult entertainment clubs, a $500,000 boat, and not one, but 2 homes in upscale neighborhoods. He'd also invested in a restaurant.
Okay, so yeah, it's one of the simplest explanations conceivable, just people being greedy people.
Yeah, he was just blowing the money on self-indulgence. Now, while Gerwing had never admitted directly to being involved in the Calverts' disappearance, in that excerpt I just read, one of his letters made a cryptic reference to it happening in SPC, which presumably stood for the Sea Pine Center, where Gerwing's office had been located. Naturally, investigators wondered what it had been. Could he have been referring to killing the Calverts? Undoubtedly, the rambling notes must have been frustrating for investigators who knew that the odds of finding the Calverts alive diminished with every day that passed, especially considering what they'd uncovered during their searches of Gerwing's properties. During their search of Gerwing's primary residence, police had found a shovel and a pile of dirt inside the home, which had otherwise been neat and clean. Gerwing, prior to his death, had claimed that he'd been using the shovel to repair the home's irrigation system, but there was no overturned earth or sign of any digging whatsoever anywhere on the property. There was also no evidence that Gerwing, an accountant by trade, was knowledgeable about irrigation repairs, and certainly if such a repair had been needed, he'd had the funds to pay a professional to handle it.
Yeah, his self-indulgence definitely doesn't feel like somebody that's going to go out to save a penny.
Sure. Now, investigators had made another notable find while searching Gerwing's GMC Yukon. Upon inspection, they discovered that the third-row seat had been removed from the large SUV. Gerwing had claimed that he'd used the space to move furniture, but there was no evidence to back that up. Investigators also noted that the vehicle had been vacuumed and professionally serviced the day after the Calverts had disappeared. Inside one of his homes, police had also found an empty handgun holster, but no gun. Perhaps even more telling than these things, though, was the deeply unsettling non-physical or circumstantial evidence that investigators uncovered. More on that And now, back to Elizabeth and John's story. After Dennis Gerwing took his own life in the wake of Elizabeth and John Calvert's double disappearance, police were left to investigate a man who would never be able to truly confess or to answer their questions. During the course of their investigation, detectives learned that on the day of the Calvert's disappearance, Gerwing had engaged in strange behavior and made some suspicious purchases. We know because that afternoon, before his scheduled meeting with the Calverts, he'd made an assistant from his work office follow him to the airport, where he'd then parked and left his Toyota sedan before directing the assistant to drive him back to the office.
That is so bizarre.
Yeah, right. Who parks their car in an airport and pays for that when they're not even flying anywhere? Very strange. Along the way, he'd had her stop at a hardware store so that he could purchase some heavy tarps, which he'd told her he'd needed for a painting job. And she probably found it strange that a man who owned a $500,000 boat and multiple homes had planned to paint his own walls. According to what cold case investigator Bob Bromage has told WJCL News, Gerwing, quote, never did anything, any manual labor at all, end quote.
I know you and I have enjoyed painting or repainting a bathroom here and there, but it doesn't sound like something Gerwing would fully appreciate.
No, totally out of character. Nevertheless, the 3 tarps he'd purchased were each heavyweight and 9 by 12 feet, or about 2.75 by 3.6 meters in size. The exact ones Gerwing purchased were never found, but the hardware store's surveillance cameras captured footage of the transaction, and investigators went to the store to procure and examine tarps identical to them. They noted that the tarps were of sufficient size and heaviness to aid in concealing bodies. After purchasing the tarps, it had nearly been time for Gerwing's 6 o'clock meeting with the Calverts. Back at the Sea Pine Center, where the club group's offices were located, John had arrived first for the meeting, followed by Elizabeth. It was the last known time either of them were seen. Around 7 o'clock, just an hour after the meeting began, Gerwing had called a coworker and had told them that the meeting had gone well, which seems unlikely given what we know. At the time, though, there had been no reason for the coworker, who'd been totally unaware of Gerwing's embezzling, to be suspicious. By that time, no other club group employees had been present at the office. According to reporting for the Savannah Morning News, one employee had planned to work late that evening, but Gerwing had called her and had told her that she couldn't because the office's computers would be down for maintenance.
While he was in a meeting.
Yes. Now, she'd agreed to work the next day instead and had later found out that it had all been a lie. There had been no computer maintenance. Furthermore, the phone call stood out to the employee who'd planned to work late because she and Gerwing had not been on good terms. It had been unusually courteous of him to call and forewarn her of the alleged computer maintenance so that she didn't come into the office for nothing.
It's painting a very clear picture of what happened.
Sure, and that evening, at just 15 minutes after 7, Gerwing had made another purchase, this time at a local pharmacy. He'd bought rubber gloves and some adhesive bandages. Minutes after that, he'd passed through a highway toll booth heading east toward his home, and a mere 10 minutes afterward, he'd stopped again, this time to purchase fuel and a lottery ticket at a gas station.
I guess he was just feeling extra lucky.
Keep in mind, he was a big gambler, so maybe this was part of that. Now, after that purchase, his whereabouts had been unknown for about 3.5 hours. Around 1 a.m., though, he'd been seen back at the Sea Pine Center, lurking in the vicinity of its restaurant, which was located right by the entrance to the club group's offices. After that sighting, he disappeared until noon the following day, which means that his whereabouts had been unknown for a solid 11 hours. Investigators suspected that Gerwing had killed the Calverts during their meeting and then had later used that 11-hour window to dispose of their bodies and other evidence of the double murder. When it came to developing that theory, investigators had been limited to information gleaned through questioning third parties or viewing security footage from highway tolls and stores. They also had what they'd observed when interviewing Gerwing himself early on in the investigation before he'd refused to speak with them anymore. On March 5th, during that interview with Gerwing, a detective had noticed a cut in the webbing of one of his hands, between his thumb and index finger. When the detective had asked Gerwing about it, he'd claimed that he'd cut his hand on a wine bottle. Now, since Gerwing was a frequent wine drinker, this wasn't exactly the most far-fetched claim in the world. However, when someone is suspected to have played a role in someone's disappearance, any injury is suspicious. Plus, this particular cut stood out to the detective. It would have stood out to anyone familiar with firearms, whether a police officer or not, because it looked exactly like slide bite.
Yeah, that was what my mind was immediately going to when you were describing what it looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And just briefly, I'll explain what slide bite is if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Essentially, with a semi-automatic firearm, it's operated by the recoil or blowback operation, and that is where the top slides back and goes above your hand or wrist in order to chamber the next round. When that happens, if you're unfamiliar with firearms or if you're new to firearms and you have your grip in the wrong place, the slide will actually come back and it's operating with enough force that the edge of it will cut into the webbing between your fingers.
Right. It's a common shooting range injury, especially among inexperienced shooters. Basically, to explain it like someone is 5, there's a piece of the gun that goes backwards when you shoot it. And if you have your hand up too high, it will cut into the webbing between your thumb and forefinger.
Yes, exactly.
Now, those cuts can range in severity from barely worse than a paper cut to bad enough to need stitches. Contrastingly, a laceration to the webbing between the thumb and forefinger is not an injury frequently incurred while opening wine bottles.
Especially if you're familiar with how to open a wine bottle.
As we know he was. Now, interestingly, Gerwing had also told police that the cut to his hand was the reason why he'd stopped to buy those adhesive bandages. He'd claimed that he hadn't had any at home. But when they searched his home, police discovered numerous boxes of adhesive bandages, so that had clearly been a lie. And remember, Gerwing didn't just buy bandages when he stopped at that pharmacy. He'd also bought rubber gloves at the same time. And I don't know anyone who wears rubber gloves when bandaging their own minor wounds, especially when those wounds are on their hands.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. And there's one piece that we haven't heard about really much of from the investigators, and that's finding out what condition his vehicle was in when he took it in for that cleaning and servicing.
We don't know. If investigators know, they haven't shared that with the public, but we can, extrapolate here and say that it needed cleaned.
Yeah.
Now, investigators were also thorough enough to search his home for any broken wine bottles that he might have cut his hand on, like he said, but they found none, not even in several days' worth of trash. Overall, things were looking pretty grim, both for the Calverts and for Gerwing, but because of his suicide, there was no hope of gaining any answers directly from Gerwing himself, other than those that he'd scribbled down in his final notes, of course. Despite this, investigators were confident that the Calverts had been killed. They didn't need a dead man to tell them that. What they did need, though, was to know where the couple's remains were. Their bodies would be key to ever fully understanding what had happened, and their grief-stricken family and friends deserved closure. However, Elizabeth and John's bodies were never found. To this day, they remain missing. And if Gerwing really did use that 11-hour window to dispose of them, their remains could be anywhere within a 5-hour radius of Hilton Head Island, and that leaves a lot of possibilities. Cities within a 5-hour drive from the island include Charlotte, North Carolina, Orlando, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, and Montgomery, Alabama, just to name a few. The sheer number of cities, towns, rural areas, and bodies of water accessible by car from Hilton Head Island during such a generous time frame is staggering, encompassing numerous states and hundreds of jurisdictions. The unfortunate truth is that there are thousands of places within the American Southeast where their remains could have been abandoned or buried with the shovel investigators found in Gerwing's home.
Let's not even discount the fact that they are literally on an island.
Yeah. In the days, weeks, and months that followed Gerwing's suicide, investigators continued to work the case. One particularly interesting piece of information was relayed to them by a friend of Gerwing's. She told them that she'd inherited a small handgun, a Beretta 22, from a family member, but since she'd had no interest in guns, she'd given it to Gerwing. Hadn't seemed like a big deal at the time, and they'd never spoken about it again. Now, a 22 caliber handgun like that Beretta is small, very small and easy to conceal. And while it's powerful enough to kill someone with, especially at a close range in a confined environment like, say, an office, as far as firearms go, it's not exactly a powerhouse. The wounds it leaves in a body are small compared to those left by weapons of larger calibers, which would be an advantage for anyone murdering someone in their office and hoping to leave as little gore behind as possible. The Beretta, which has never been found, was the gun the empty holster belonged to. You know, the one that police found in Gerwing's home.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about being as close as an office would allow, it really wouldn't be considered an underpowered firearm, I don't think.
Right.
Especially if you have the ability to surprise them with it.
Sure.
When you get up into a more conventional round, like a 9mm, which is, as I often say, one of the more common firearms for self-defense, then you start having to worry about what's called overpenetration, or where the bullet will exit the body and it will take blood and leave a hole wherever it lands in, say, a wall.
Yeah.
And one more thing with that 22 is, as you being an EMT know,
former EMT,
the 22, it's likely to leave a very small blood trail, even from the entrance wound. Sometimes it's almost impossible to see where the bullet even entered the body because it's such a small and lightweight round. So it could have been a very advantageous round for him if he wanted to kill somebody without leaving much of a blood signature trace.
Right. Imagine shooting someone with something that's basically the size of an eraser off the end of a pencil. The bullet is most likely not going to pass through the victim's body. It's probably going to become stuck somewhere inside instead of striking a wall and leaving evidence that way. And again, minimal blood and gore.
Yes.
In the years since the Calvert's disappearance, the Beaufort County Sheriff's Department has been pretty vocal, not just about their belief that the couple was murdered, but also in the belief that Gerwing was responsible. And it's easy to see why. Still, if you search the favorite playground of armchair detectives everywhere, the internet, you'll find some theories that differ somewhat from those presented by police. Firstly, there's the third victim theory, which focuses on the fact that Gerwing purchased 3 of the large heavy-duty tarps. Some people think this indicates that there was a third victim, perhaps a co-conspirator in the embezzlement and/or the murders. Personally, I don't think it means anything more than the fact that Gerwing, in a rare moment of moderate criminal intelligence, decided that in addition to wrapping both bodies in a tarp, it would also be a good idea to have a third tarp to spread over the interior of his vehicle to shield it from any physical evidence that escaped the makeshift body bags.
Honestly, that makes just as much sense, if not more sense, than there being a third person.
However, supporters of this theory point out that Gerwing was an obese man in at least relatively physically poor shape. They argue that it would have been difficult, maybe even impossible, for Gerwing to move the Calvert's bodies on his own. An accomplice would have made it much easier to lift the bodies, place them in the vehicle, and then dispose of them. And then, when that was done, Gerwing could have wrapped the crime up in a neat little bow by killing the accomplice at the murder site, wrapping them up in a third tarp, and abandoning them there too, sort of like in the movies.
It just felt like such an old movie trope to me.
It sounds like the opening scene of The Dark Knight, with the clowns robbing the bank.
Yeah.
So, you know what they say, though, 2 people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. But here's the thing. If there was a third victim, who was it? Odds are, if someone else associated with Gerwing in any way had disappeared, investigators would have taken notice, but that's never happened. There's no missing third person. Now, if we venture out further, perhaps into the realm of conspiracy theories, some people believe it's possible that Dennis Gerwing was just one of 2 or more, possibly many individuals involved in the embezzlement scheme, which again would explain how Gerwing was able to move the Calvert's bodies. But unlike the last theory, they believe that Gerwing's suicide wasn't a suicide at all. They believe that he was murdered by his co-conspirators and that the death was staged to look like a suicide.
I even had that thought earlier.
Well, this theory is unsupported by the fact that there were no footprints or other evidence found in the condo bathroom to indicate that anyone besides Gerwing had been there. As cold case investigator Bob Bromage has explained to WJCL News, quote, "We made entry into the bathroom and it was covered in blood. There was nothing leading out of the bathroom. There was no blood transfer out of the bathroom," end quote. So unless these alleged murderers could levitate, that just does not seem possible.
Yeah, we talk about defensive wounds and attacking wounds whenever somebody's using a knife in particular to the attacker's hands.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they're using a dull serrated knife, I could definitely see there being a lot of force needed and that creating some of those wounds also. So I think that you would definitely have an attacker's wounds.
Yeah. Additionally, the blood spatter present was consistent with self-inflicted injuries. Furthermore, Gerwing took his life in a painfully sloppy way. It's clear that he tried numerous times to create a fatal wound, failing again and again before he finally succeeded. Dosing someone with antihistamines and subjecting them to a procession of inefficient slicing wounds with a dull steak knife does not seem like a likely method of homicide. Rather, those seem like the desperate actions of a man who'd backed himself into a corner and had hastily decided that there was only one way out of it. Both of these alternate theories lean heavily on the fact that it would have been difficult for one man, Gerwing, to physically move two adult bodies on his own. When they bring this up, they focus on his weight, pointing out that he was an obviously overweight individual. But here's the thing, being obese doesn't necessarily mean that someone can't move a substantial amount of weight.
And he had plenty of opportunity to stop and rest.
11 hours.
He was unaccounted for a very long amount of time. If he were to bury the bodies and use that dirt and shovel, which, why would you move it into your house? I don't know. But again, 11 hours, you can get a lot of work done in 11 hours.
Right. I don't know what kind of shape Gerwing's spine and knees were in, but those factors almost certainly would have affected his lifting ability more so than his body fat percentage. In fact, heavier individuals typically have more absolute strength than their slender counterparts simply because their muscles build strength as a necessity to bear and move their own body weight. Furthermore, neither Elizabeth nor John were large people. Elizabeth, in particular, was petite, weighing in at only about 120 pounds, and John, although taller than her, was also slender. Compared to Gerwing, they were both small, and I don't think it strains credulity to suggest that he could have moved their bodies on his own, especially when we consider the effects of adrenaline, and especially if he used the tarps to drag their weight when needed. In my opinion, it's possible that Gerwing disposed of their remains on his own, no co-conspirators necessary.
As you said, using a tarp to drag somebody, that would make it even easier for him.
And if anyone wants to judge for themselves, head to our website. The link is in the show notes. We've got photos of Gerwing, John, and Elizabeth there, and you can see for yourself that compared to the couple, Gerwing was a big guy. To this day, investigators stand by their theory that Gerwing acted alone. The Calverts were declared legally dead in 2009, about a year and a half after their disappearance. To the disappointment of their loved ones, their remains have never been located. Investigators are still ready to respond to any tips. Recently, in 2025, cold case investigator Bob Bromage explained that they've looked everywhere they can, everywhere they've gotten tips for, they've followed all leads, but they still haven't found the Calverts, and they're still looking for more information from the public. So if you know anything about what happened to Elizabeth and John or where they may be now, please call the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office at 843-524-2777. Or, if you prefer to remain anonymous, the South Carolina Crime Stoppers at 1-888-274-6372.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like John and Elizabeth's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Dope Project. Last Seen Alive is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.